This is all about Bitcoin, a show dedicated to all things questions and markets related to Bitcoin, little b for the currency, and Bitcoin, big B for the network, a collective journey to understand, apply, and use this innovation, all Bitcoin, all the time. I'm your host, Christine Lee. Let's have a live look at Bitcoin right now. The CoinDesk Bitcoin price, XVX index at $44,018. Bitcoin is up about 4.5% over the past 24 hours. The most reliable reference prices for institutions since 2014 are now published under the CoinDesk brand, trusted globally as the leader in crypto news, events, and data. Let's take a look at some of the top stories moving markets. Russian President Vladimir Putin partially withdrawing troops along the Russia-Ukraine border, signaling a de-escalation of geopolitical tensions with NATO. Global equities and the crypto markets rallying as a risk-on sentiment returns. Separately, Russia's central bank and government are seemingly no closer to an agreement on crypto regulation, a sign of how wide the spread between their positions remains, even after a document last week set out plans to legitimize the asset class. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act for the first time since the law was passed in 1988 in response to the now weeks-long trucker-led protests against COVID restrictions that have jammed streets in Ottawa and blocked key crossings at the U.S.-Canada border. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland saying banks can immediately freeze or suspend bank accounts without a court order and without fear of civil liability. The move expands money laundering laws to include crowdfunding platforms and cryptocurrency transactions. And joining us now to discuss is Abby Deshman, Director of Criminal Justice for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Hi there, Abby. Thanks for joining us. So this is the first time the Emergencies Act has been invoked since it was passed in 1988. Can you tell us about the act and the power it gives and when it's supposed to be invoked?
Yeah, absolutely. This is extraordinary legislation. As you say, it's the first time it has ever been used, despite the fact that we've been living in a pandemic for 2 years and have had lots of emergency acts invoked. The federal one has never been used. And it gives extraordinary powers to government. It concentrates power in the executive branch. So that is the prime minister and the ministers. And they are able to authorize emergency orders that really will bypass other laws, other checks and balances on law enforcement actions that we would expect, and to do so without the authority of Parliament for at least 2 days. So it's extraordinary powers, and it is intended to be reserved for real national emergencies. So if you look at the legislation, it talks about things like war, national pandemics that can't be handled by the provinces. There is a public order section of the legislation, but it is supposed to only be used when the provinces can't deal with the situation and existing laws and powers are insufficient. And that's really where we have concerns about the use of this legislation in this circumstance. We certainly have protests across the country. They are extremely disruptive, particularly on the border and in Ottawa. But we actually have seen local police very effectively use their existing powers and laws to police these protests.
So you don't think this high threshold has been met?
No, we don't think the high threshold has been met. And, it's high for a reason. It's high because the powers are extremely concentrated. Mm-hmm. It is a check and balance on the use of this legislation. And we don't think that we've met it in this case.
So I understand there's also an expansion of anti-money laundering laws to freeze bank accounts, crowdfunding platforms, and Bitcoin transactions. How is the government able to do that? Like, what kind of due process is involved, if any?
Yeah, so if this happens under the Emergency Act, and we don't have the details of the orders yet, but these are the types of things that are being contemplated, there won't be much due process. It really does seem like they are headed towards authorizing the freezing of assets based on information that somebody has supported one of the protests or the blockades. And, we don't have any definition of support. So that could be a very low, $5 donation. It could be giving somebody a ride to drop them off at a protest. And we also don't have any indication of what the limits are on seizure of assets, freezing of bank accounts. Is it all of your bank accounts? Is it only the amount that you donated? None of that is clear. But we do have some precedent under terrorism financing restrictions that, is very broad powers to freeze the assets of people who are designated as terrorists or terrorist organizations. So if that's the sort of thing that's being contemplated, in this case, without any judicial oversight, without any warrants, it is very broad and far-reaching powers.
Is there any way to appeal or dispute this decision by the Prime Minister?
Yeah, so there's a couple mechanisms, both democratic and legal. So the first democratic mechanism is within 2 days of any specific order coming out from the federal government, it does have to go before Parliament. So Parliament does have a chance to look at the order after it's already come out and been in effect for up to 2 days. So that is one democratic check and balance that's built into the legislation. And then there are some legal recourses, but it's not, there's no inbuilt appeal mechanism. You could try to launch a review of the legislation or the use of the legislation, or the constitutionality of what's been done, but there's no easy judicial recourse.
I mean, just one final question before we wrap, but does this establish a dangerous precedent for Canada?
Absolutely. I'm quite concerned. You know, we have thousands of protests across this country every year, the vast majority of which are entirely peaceful, but many of which are very disruptive, and some are disruptive on a national scale. It is extremely concerning to see emergency legislation across the country being used to address what are extremely disruptive, but for the vast majority of them, ultimately peaceful protests. So we need to be able to live in a country where we have a really high tolerance for disruptive protests. That's part of being in a democracy. And we also need to rely on the democratic mechanisms and laws that are in place in order to find out what are appropriate limits to those protests.
Very surprising. All right, Abby, thank you so much for joining us. It's a developing story. We'll certainly be monitoring that in the coming days. That was Abby Deshman, Director of Criminal Justice for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Right, taking a look at more top stories. Deutsche Bank's The Future of Cryptocurrencies report found most crypto traders would hold on to their crypto even if the markets crash. Specifically, fewer than half the investors surveyed would reduce investments or leave the market entirely, even if prices fell 80%. And most say they bought crypto for the first time over the past 12 months. Finally, El Salvador's initial $1 billion Bitcoin bond issue will take place between March 15th and March 20th, according to Finance Minister Alejandro Zelaya. Investors will be able to take part in the deal with as little as $100 with a 6.5% coupon using Liquid, a Bitcoin-based service created by Blockstream. Joining us now to discuss is Samson Mow, Chief Investment Officer at Blockstream. Hello there, Samson. Thanks for joining us as well. So the Bitcoin bond is coming, and when you were last on CoinDesk here with us, you told us $300 million worth of soft commitments were made. Do you have an update on those numbers? Any hard commitments?
There's a lot of interest, and the VanEck team has stopped taking commitments after 500 million. So I think the focus now is working with issuer and El Salvador to work on their key information document, which will outline the specific investment details of the volcano bond. And then they'll probably have a sign-up form or something where people can register and put their names on the list. Just a correction, though, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer, not Investment Officer. Sorry
about that, Chief Strategy Officer. We got to correct that. All right. Where are these commitments coming from? Are they pension funds, sovereign wealth funds? What is the trend are you seeing?
From what I'm seeing, it's just wealthy Bitcoiners, Bitcoin whales, and crypto companies, crypto hedge funds. I think the pension funds, institutional money will come later. Everyone's watching to see how the first volcano bond goes and just making sure everything works perfectly. And then I think the more risk-averse players will come in at a later date.
Right. I also hear the Bitcoin bond is actually a way to de-risk Bitcoin investments because you only share the gains and not the losses. The Bitcoin bond gives 25% upside, but no Bitcoin downside. Is that correct?
It's a 6.5% coupon, and after the first 5 years, El Salvador will recoup 500 million that was used to buy the Bitcoin initially. So there's 500 million that is allocated to buy Bitcoin for the bond. And after that 5-year mark and after that recouping of 500 million, they will share all the Bitcoin upside 50% with the bondholders. And that's called the Bitcoin dividend. So it's like an extra coupon on top of the 6.5%.
In terms of risk of default, is it at the cost of El Salvador's risk of default?
I think it's just the 6.5% is in line with typical bond benchmarks now, and right now it's under inflation indexes, but I don't think it has anything to do with the default risk. And the issuer in this case is actually Laheo. It's the geothermal plant, geothermal company in El Salvador.
Do you have an official launch date, Samson?
No, I'm just waiting along with everyone else. I believe the law, the new digital securities issuance law will go to their Congress in the coming week or two. And then the Minister Zelaya has said the bonds will go live in March 15th to 20th. So I'm sticking with that timeline.
Awesome. Samson, thanks so much. That was Samson Mow, Chief Strategy Officer at Blockstream. All right, coming up, BTC price analysis with ETF and mutual fund manager VanEck.
The chart of the day is brought to you by Crypto.com, the world's fastest growing crypto app.
Bitcoin rising with global markets amid renewed risk on sentiment following the partial pullback of Russian troops along the Ukraine border. Still, the latest rally is occurring on low volume, similar to previous price pumps, indicating weak buying strength. The relative strength index on the daily chart is approaching overbought territory, which could keep buyers active on dips. On the monthly chart, however, momentum signals remain negative, suggesting limited upside for BTC around $46,000 to $50,000, according to CoinDesk's VanEck and Dante. Looking at economic data, wholesale prices jumped to a near record of 9.7% over the past year, another sign of runaway inflation, which could lend fuel to the Bitcoin as an inflation hedge argument. Forex firm Oanda saying if tensions on the Ukraine border decrease in the days ahead, investors will, quote, focus on U.S. economic data. All right, joining us now to discuss BTC price and more is VanEck CEO Jan VanEck. Hello there, Jan. Thanks for joining us. So, Bitcoin is up. We've got some thin volumes. Peers tensions in Europe, Eurasia are simmering down. What do you make of Bitcoin's short-term price outlook?
Sure. It's. I guess I'd look at it more from an intermediate or longer-term outlook and try to place it within that context. I very much feel that Bitcoin is a maturing asset, and it's one I'm very bullish on. I think it can go up to 25,000 in the next several years. I really think it's a competitor to gold. Having said that, I think in 2017, my colleague and I said, listen, there's a 90% downside to Bitcoin. It's still very immature, and it's not widely enough held. That's really changed. I think last year was a dramatic year for Bitcoin. And we said, listen, the downside is probably 50% from its all-time highs. And it's hit that earlier this quarter. So I think looking forward to the rest of the year, maybe on the optimistic scenario, either we've seen the bottoms or maybe it tests one more time before the Fed actually starts raising rates in March. That's kind of the optimistic view. The more pessimistic view is that the financial markets generally will have trouble digesting these interest rate hikes and the pullback on quantitative easing, and that we might start talking about the recession word later in the year. As you know, China is also a very important driver of the world economy and markets, and it's struggling to get through its real estate issues. So I've personally been buying. I'm a big believer in the 50% pullback. I think we've seen that. I think that's where the support is. So that's the summary. But we may have some turbulence throughout the rest of the year for the reasons I outlined.
At the same time, in the United States, at least, lawmakers are taking a hard look at stablecoins. There's a hearing happening right now on stablecoins. What do you think that may have in terms of an impact on Bitcoin and the crypto markets at large?
Sure. I mean, VanEck has been around since 1955. We're a heavily regulated entity. We talk with the SEC often. We have a futures-based Bitcoin product in the market, XBTF. But I'm really confused a little bit by the discussions of regulation around crypto and Bitcoin included. And stablecoins is something that I just wrote an opinion piece on. And basically, what I said is stablecoins operate. The way they operate is very similar to ETFs, meaning they trade on exchanges. They're not guaranteed to track their investment target, right? So the price of Tether, for example, can fluctuate above and below the $1 per Tether benchmark. It's created in big chunks, just like ETFs are. You can't go directly to an ETF company and buy it. So I think I'm kind of wondering why the SEC doesn't look at stablecoin and sort of say, why don't we try something similar type of regulation? Even funnier in a way, in an ironic way, is the BlockFi regulation or the settlement with the SEC that came out yesterday on Valentine's Day. And there, you'd think that if you deposited something, Christine, right, and you got interest on it, you'd go to the banking regulators, right? I mean, that feels more like a bank. And instead, it was the SECs that said BlockFi was operating in terms of selling its securities and needed to be regulated through the SEC. So we'll see. It's kind of like what does it really look like? I think a stable coin looks more like a private fund, but we'll see how the regulators come out. I just really wanted to advance the discussion.
Yeah, on the other side of that, folks are saying, there were no victims in that case, yet investors were pretty happy with their investment return. And everyone, seemed to get, a good share of what they had expected, and yet they're being dinged with a $100 million fine by the SEC. I know you also have a Bitcoin spot ETF.
Can I jump in on that?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that's part of the point, right? No one was talking, and this is why I want to get this dialogue going. No one was really talking about how BlockFi should be regulated. Whether these interest products were securities or whether they should really be regulated by banks. Washington is itself very confused on this matter. And I think the SEC has interestingly put themselves in a box because they've actually frozen BlockFi's business in terms of new accounts or adding funds. And they're saying, go get a regulated securities license from us, and that'll take 60 days. So we'll see if the SEC can turn it around in 60 days, because otherwise they're really punishing a business even more, which they normally don't do with settlements.
So, and you guys are interested in getting a Bitcoin spot ETF out there. That's kind of on the back burner. In the meantime, I don't know if you see that happening anytime soon. And you're launching a multi-token cryptocurrency fund. What can you tell us about that? And that's happening in Europe.
Yeah, sure. I mean, while the U.S. is sort of going in circles from a regulatory perspective, Europe is getting very crypto friendly. We last week launched our 8th ETN in Europe, and they operate very similarly to ETFs in the US, except they use a note as a legal entity. But this is our first multi-token ETN offering, and so it just invests in the top 5 or 6 tokens right now. to make these products really investable and tradable, they have to have wallet support. They have to have regulatory approval. So right now, there's not very many of these tokens that be included, but that's increasing by the day. So the options for European investors are really growing in a really healthy way.
All right, Jan, thanks for coming on. Appreciate your insights. That was VanEck CEO Jan VanEck. All right, that's it for All About Bitcoin. I'm your host, Christine Lee. We'll do it all over again tomorrow at 3 o'clock in New York, or we'll actually be in Denver. Also join us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for First Mover. You're watching CoinDesk TV. Just a reminder, we are headed to ETH Denver at CoinDesk, so see you there in the morning.